formally going to introduce myself, Samuel Rowe. Don't mind if you call me Sam. Cloud Solution Architect for Microsoft. I like to contribute to open source projects wherever I can. And this is a quick lightning talk on Codespaces, specifically GiHub Codespaces. Are we recording, by the way, gents?
Yes,
yeah.
We are now.
Excellent. So I'm going to keep this session as PowerPoint free as possible and go into some demos as quickly as possible. But I just wanted to first off just touching what is a code space and why. Well, code spaces are a way of creating instant development environments, and we want to be able to do that because we want to reduce the time that developers can get to realizing development value. So what do I mean by that? I'm sure we've all been there at some point. You join a new project and somebody says, to actually build this code, you need to install this, you need to install that, you need to install X, Y, and Z. If you're in a really well-functioning team, they might have a build, a document that gives you that, some wiki pages or something, and you follow it through, find that there's something missing off the list that you didn't know you needed to install, and need to do any of the other developers. You go and get that installed, and before you know it, you've wasted, anywhere from a few hours to a couple of days making your development environment ready so that you can actually start coding. And if your PC breaks because your disk dies or something, you've got to start again, unless you're doing it in a virtual machine or something. So that's kind of where code spaces kind of came from that perspective of being able to get up to a development environment quickly. One of the other pieces we want to do with code spaces is make sure that you've got consistency as well. So if I just give a little bit of a background of myself and a story there, when I used to live up in the Midlands, I worked at a company in Stafford, and this is 10 years ago nearly that I worked with these guys, and they had lots of paired programming going on in the business. So we had little pods. We called them pods. It was like a group of tables together with exactly the same desktop PC on each table, same specs and everything, same monitors, same keyboards and mice, and you'd have a pair of programmers sitting at that desk. And for a consistency's purpose, we used to use Windows deployment services to push out a golden image to each one of these dev machines. And this meant that as the pairs used to rotate, so one of the people would move around to another team and another table once a week, they knew where all the keyboard shortcuts were. They knew where all of what was going to be installed on the development environment. They knew that if it worked on the development workstation number 1, it would work on development workstation number 7. So it didn't matter who they were working with or what part of the code base they were working on. They had a very low kind of barrier to entry. I was very lucky in that organization as well. The managing director and the operations director and the head of software engineering were very supportive of making sure there wasn't any configuration drift by enforcing Windows deployment service to run and wipe these dev machines periodically. So I think, I can't remember exactly how frequently I used to do it. I think it was either once a week or once every other week I used to do that. And it just made sure that everybody checked their code in and that everything was the same. And with GitHub Codespaces, you are defining your code space using a set of text files that we'll talk about in a bit. And those text files are stored with a repository, and that gives you that consistency of environment as well. So every time you go to a new, work on a new machine and you open up your code space, you're going to get exactly the same development experience as you would if you'd done it on another machine. And that takes us through to the last part, which is that extension and customization I've got up on the screen as well. As you want to improve your development environment and you want to make it have more features, well, rather than just installing them as an extension into your local kind of environment and not sharing the wealth of that new extension with your colleagues, you actually bake it back into the same configuration files and make it part of the repository. And you can even have the same kind of PR process that you would, pull request process as you would for other kind of parts of the software, to make those same changes. So let's move on to what it kind of looks like. So as you can see here, this is the GitHub page. Oh, go on, Benny. Sorry, my graphics card just crashed. Please don't ask why I was looking at pizza. So this is the GitHub page for a project that an open source project that a friend of mine works on. It's a book of open source tips. And if I want to open up this particular repo in a dev container, I've got a little code button that you'll probably recognize. And if I click on that code button, I get a little pull down. That gives me an option to open it up in a code space. I could create a new code space as well. Sorry, I skipped ahead too many slides there. So I get open with code spaces. I choose which code space I'm going to open it with. I wait a short while. It builds my code space, and that code space then opens up inside my web browser, and it looks very much like VS Code, and we'll touch on why it does that in a minute. This particular open source book requires a load of Ruby components to be stored like ASCII Doctor, so that you can actually build it and build the PDF document that comes out the back end of it. So you can see here, I even got a terminal down the bottom, which allows me to run the make command, and then it goes through all the steps to create that PDF. One of the next really cool parts of this as well is there's actually a live server extension that you can run, and you can port forward through those extensions so that you can then click through and open up that website. I'm just showing you here using the curl command that you can actually hit it, and you can even run that development website outside in your code space rather than running it on your local machine. I just wanted to touch on one final piece here, and this is where my favourite part about Codespaces, genuinely is my favourite thing about Codespaces, is it's democratizing the devices that we use to be able to code. You may have noticed these are slides in a PowerPoint deck, and the more observant of you might have noticed that this final slide here is actually from an iPad. Now, this is my 2016 model iPad from Generation 5 iPad, and I was sat on the sofa with my wife doing some pieces in this the other day. I didn't take the screenshots at that point, but I can contribute using my iPad. I don't need a full-blown PC to do this. I can use an iPad, I could use my Raspberry Pi. It really doesn't matter, because behind the scenes, my dev container, the piece of code that the container that this code space is running in the cloud. So actually all I need is a modern web browser to be able to access the interface. The piece that's doing all the heavy lifting, that's running my development environment, is somewhere else. And that, for me, is a really important thing, because not all of us can afford, not every business gives us the opportunity to have expensive laptops. Not every business has the opportunity to do that, whereas every business can afford to derive value from new software being developed and link that back to the cost per hour of actual development time. Because you pay a small fee per hour of running code space, or you will when it goes into the public domain, for every hour of development work that's done. Cool. So at which point, let's get on with the actual demo, and we will see this in action. First of all, I just wanted to touch on, I mentioned a few times that Visual Studio Codespace, GitHub Codespaces, and dev containers for Visual Studio Code, they are all really the same thing. let's make no bones about it. Under the hood, GiHub Codespaces is a way of using a GitHub URL to open up the user interface for Visual Studio Code, where the container side, the dev container piece that's going to actually run your development environment, is running inside GitHub Cloud. And this diagram here kind of shows you the split of VS Code using the themes and the source code. You see the front end in local OS. Well, that actually happens in your browser with Visual Studio Code. You know, some caveats there. And then the back end is where the Visual Studio Code server's running, and it's got all the workspace extensions, the source code actually stored there. It talks to the file system, the terminal processes, etc. on the back end. And this is actually it's exactly the same whether you're running this in Visual Studio Codespaces, Visual Studio Code with dev containers locally, or whether you're running this in GitHub Codespaces. The development environment can be changed and configured by looking at the dev container JSON file, and we'll go into actually what some of those parts look like later on. But for the moment, I just wanted to show you that there's a really great document, and just so that you've got visual memory of being able to find this. If you just search for dev container JSON reference, you should be able to find this quite quickly in the search engine of your choice. And this goes through how to create remote containers and other kind of pieces if you want to run this locally. And it's also worth noting that you can run dev containers inside WSL. So you can run the dev container inside WSL using Docker, and then have the front end inside Windows. So, and the last thing I just wanted to touch on was that this is all made possible by the fact that the Visual Studio Code front end is built using a cross-platform tool called Electron.js. Yeah, as is Teams, Figma, Twitch, and Visual Studio Code, as I just mentioned. Cool. Before I move on to actually like building a Visual Code space, does anybody have any questions? No? Cool. Excellent. So I'm going to take a look quickly then at this open source book that we were looking at earlier on, and actually show you a live example of that running, because I wanted to show you how quickly this actually takes to get spun up. So as I did before, I go to code, and I actually built this code space earlier on. So we've got the Samro book open source tips. It's there. Now this is actually being built from the master branch. It's important to note that you can actually build these against a particular branch as well. So if you are, as I said, developing the dev container reference, you know, the changing the environment, you can make those changes, push them to another branch, and then open up a new dev container that runs it side by side, so you can actually see the impact of that without having to start and stop the original. While GiHub Codespaces is part of a closed preview at the moment, we are limited to 2 code spaces. And if anybody wants, at the end, I can show you the link on how to sign up to get onto the Codespaces beta. Now, when we actually open this up, it's quite, this Codespace has been put to sleep. So what that means is when you start a Codespace, it builds out a container in the back end. That container sits there running with your web browser connected to it. If you disconnect for more than about half an hour, and I'm hoping this will be configurable, it is configurable in Visual Studio Codespaces, so I'm hoping it will be configurable in GiHub Codespaces in the future, then that container in the background gets stopped, not deleted, but stopped. And when you come back to it, it re-wakes it back up. So as you can see, this is that dev container that I just showed you the slides from, and I can have a look through here, and we can see that we've got README file, we've got make file, we've got a build directory, etc. And if I run the make command, this goes off and it runs those pieces that we talked about. And we can see here there's an ASCII doctor being run. So I'm just going to quickly investigate with you here to say that if we look in this dev container folder, we can see there's a Docker file and a dev container.json file. Now the dev container.json file is kind of the glue that marries together the Docker file and other pieces. So this talks about which extensions are going to be installed into the Visual Studio Code front end that we're seeing here, the GitHub Codespace front end. It talks about the port forwards that are happening, and it talks about the integrated terminal that's going to be used and the Docker file that's going to be used for building the code space. Now that Docker file itself is the piece that describes what's going to end up inside the code space backend container. So in this case here, the instructions were rather simple. It just needs ASCII doctor and it needs a gem install with a --pre ASCII doctor PDF. And once you've got both of those, then it's there and running. Now I have forgotten what the command is to run the server. I think it's in the README. I can't remember what the command is now. My mind has gone to mush today. But if I was to run the live site extension on this, because I have a live site live server extension, then I can click go live and it should run the site. And it starts it up on port 5500. And I can then go to my Remote Explorer on the left-hand side. And from there, I can see what ports have been forwarded. So as I showed you in that Docker file, in the dev container.json file, I have set up the port forwarding through to port 5500. So I can now just click the little open in browser, and that then will port forward my local browser web page through to the server on the back end, at which point I can go and actually have a look and see the book being rendered, the HTML being rendered. So that's a very kind of brief kind of example of it being in use, and to, that's an example that's already set up and created. I wanted to now just give a demonstration to take this to the next level, where we're going to start from scratch and build a new dev container in a new repository in a completely blank space. There will be some uncomfortable pauses because there's a few things that take a minute or two. I'm not going to be baking in any time. There's no made earlier. This is real time to show you how quickly you can go from a new code repository to building a blog site using Jekyll. Yeah, but while I just close these pieces up, I'm just going to give it there a minute or so space for any questions. Well, no questions. Cool. Let's crack on then. So I am going to create a new repository, and this is not going to use a template. This is called demo blog site. I'm going to add a README to it. I'm not going to add a gitignore file for the moment, but I will choose a license. It's always good practice to set a license. Microsoft wants us to do an MIT license majority of the time. So we will click create repository there. And we now have a new repo. Now we'll click and create a new code space. Now this is, you can see here, we've got no active code spaces. It's not going to show me my other code spaces because they're not relevant in this context. You notice that the life cycle for a code space is with the repository itself. And that's a big difference from the GitHub Codespaces, sorry, the Visual Studio Codespaces that are being retired. So if I click new code space here, and we'll let this run through to build it. There's no hidden magic here. I'm not shortening any scenes. This is literally the experience you would get of creating a new code space from scratch. So we can see the step where it's built the container. Because this is the standard container, it's built it quite quickly. And then it runs the container, and we should see the code space open up in our browser quite quickly. Now, I made a common mistake that I make repeatedly when I'm using GitHub Codespaces, and I opened it up in the main browser tab rather than in a new tab. So let me just do that quickly. So this is a blank code space. There is nothing here. How does GitHub choose which code space to use and what background container to base it on? Well, there are a lot of different containers it can choose from. There's some hidden magic behind the scenes that kind of looks at what code is in your repo. Because it is a blank repo, it generally chooses one based upon recent repositories that I've used. There is a repo, which I'll show you now, which is the Microsoft Visual VS Code Dev Containers repo, and inside there's a folder called Containers, and this is a whole list of Docker files that are ready to rock and roll to base your Visual Studio Codespace or GitHub Codespace or Dev Container on top of. Now, in this case, if I go back to my Codespace and I say run Jekyll, we can see Jekyll's not found, so this doesn't have Jekyll installed, and I want to create a Jekyll site. So I can look at the Jekyll container, because there is one ready here, and I can see there's an example dev container, there's an example.vs code. Now the VS Code folder sets up things like keyboard extensions and shortcuts that you'd want to use, so we can kind of ignore that for the moment. It's something that you might want to choose to use or not. The npm ignore folder as well, the kind of more specific, and the instructions are quite simple. The basis is copy the folder of the contents of the dev container to the root of your project. So we want to copy this Docker file and this dev container.json file to the root of my code space, and I'm going to cheat and slightly and do that through the CLI. So we're going to make a directory called .devcon, and inside dev container I'm going to get the raw Docker file, I'm then going to get the raw dev container.json. And as I said, this is literally, there's no steps missing here. If you were to repeat this tomorrow, you would get exactly the same results, and you'd have yourself a working Jekyll development environment. I've got a Docker file and a dev container there, that I can see. Now, this Docker file is basing itself on the another Docker container image for Ruby version 2. It sets some environment variables. It makes sure that Jekyll's installed inside Bundler, and it does a couple of other pieces in there. The dev container.json file, make sure that that Docker file is the one that's used. It mandates that node set to an LTS version. It sets the the bin bash there, it doesn't actually have any extensions installed, but does set up a port forward. Yeah. Now, the post create bundle install command, that's currently commented out. I could uncomment that out, and if I was to look at the dev container reference for the post create command, we can quickly validate what that's going to do, and that's going to basically run after the container's been created, that script. Yeah, it's important to note that some of these aren't supported. So, for example, the post start container, the post start command, and the post attach command are not yet supported in Codespaces, so they only work with Visual Studio dev containers. One other thing to notice, if you want to add an extension, so if I go back to my extensions list and I look for a Jekyll extension, like a Jekyll snippets or Jekyll syntax support, and I want to add this particular extension, say, to my dev container, this here is what's known as the extension ID. So we're just going to copy this bit. It's a bit hard to see because the colors aren't great. I don't know why they chose to make it kind of grey on grey, but if you, that is where you'll get the extension ID from. Didn't mean to do that. So if we go back to our source code and we look at the dev container.json file, I can then add that into my extensions, and that will mean that that extension gets run. So I'm going to save that, and we go back to on the left hand side under the actions menu, the git commands, the version control commands, and I'm going to add my changes, to stage my changes, and I'm going to add that as a command, add this in. And this bit I'm hoping will help as well, show what some of the advantages here, because we've never left GitHub at this point. We've been doing everything in the web browser from GitHub, going backwards and forwards. I can now do a push pull and or a sync, and this will just work because the code space itself has been set up with my credentials. So my dev container has already got my credentials in there, and we can see that that now has synchronized background. So if I go back to my blog site and quickly refresh, we can now see I have a .dev container folder in there. We're not quite running at this point. So if I close this tab and I go back to here, I can see that I still have the same code space running. Now, I've already got two code spaces running, so I'm going to have to delete one to create a new one. I don't need that code space anymore. I'm now treating code spaces as an ephemeral work unit, the same way as I do treat cloud kind of infrastructure now. I use infrastructure as code to build it, I use it, and when I'm finished with it, I destroy it. And when I create a new code space, this bit does take about 3 minutes to run through, 3.5 minutes. This is going to go through the same cycle that we saw before, but this time you'll notice that it's going to take a lot longer in the build container phase, because this time round what it's going to be doing is it's going to be pulling down that different container and then running the scripts to install the Jekyll file, Jekyll inside it. Yeah. There's nothing I can do apart from just let us have an uncomfortable pause while that one runs through, but I didn't want to miss any steps because I think it's important for everybody here to see that this really is genuinely how quickly you can get started with Codespaces and build out these things. So while this is just building out this container, has anybody got any questions?
I think there's one in the...
Is there one in the chat window?
Yeah.
Yes, there is somewhere where I can see all of the code spaces. So I'm just going to let that keep running. And I think if you go to github.com codespaces, just like that, it will show me all of my currently running code spaces. Yeah, so I'm hoping that kind of answers that question. And the other thing to note there as well is you can do things like I could delete it from here, or when we go past the beta limit of having 2 code spaces, I could create a new code space there. Any other questions?
There's another one, Sam.
Cool. So there is a cost associated with it, or there will be a cost associated with it. What those costs are at the moment, I don't have 100% visibility to. So let me, while that's still opening up, I'm going to open up a new browser tab over here. Take a quick look. As I did find this the other day. No. So the link for signing up is there, by the way. So I'll throw that in the chat window as well while we're just waiting for this to build. As I said, it does take a few minutes for that to build through. I have seen the pricing. I can't remember where it is. The Visual Studio Code space pricing. Is easier to get hold of, and I suspect that it will be very similar eventually. There are 2 components to the pricing. There is a storage cost for your container, because as we saw, that there's that front end piece and there's the actual container that's running. That container that's running has a storage cost whether it started or stopped. There is then a run cost for that container. The storage cost for Visual Studio Codespaces is 0.088 cents an hour, and the run cost depends upon how big it is, as in how many cores it's got and RAM. Now, the GiHub Codespaces, I have seen pricing for it. As you've just seen, I can't see it. I haven't been able to find it quickly. I'm certain that when it comes out of beta, that it will be made more easily available and accessible than it currently is. But yeah, I wouldn't expect it to be very different pricing from what you can see there, because that is the official pricing for Visual Studio Codespaces currently, and the 2 are very similar. Cool. At which point, let's get back to the actual demo. So you can see we've been, what, another couple of minutes, and we're now at a point where if I run bundle exec Jekyll, I now actually have okay, I actually have Jekyll installed. Yeah, and if I create a new site with Jekyll, Jekyll new demo blog, it's going to create me a new a folder called demo blog with everything that I need ready and waiting for it. And then if I cd into that demo blog folder, I can do a bundle install to make sure I've got all of those gem files installed. For anybody that's used Jekyll, it's based upon Ruby, so you've got to make sure you install the bundles from the gem file. And if I then do a bundle exec Jekyll serve -- live reload, this starts my Jekyll server, and because my my dev container .devcontainer.json file has got this mapped through, I can just click follow link through there, and I now have my Jekyll demo blog running in my dev container and ready for me to come back. And just to show you that this really is kind of real time, if I put the two side by side and I go back to my index.markdown and I put a new header in here, save that file, we can see that it's registered the change and changed it. And if I do a control refresh on the other site, we can see this is here. So I've now got my new demo site up and running. And that's been what, less than 10 minutes from creating a repo to having a demo environment ready to rock and roll. And just to prove that I've got that extension installed as well, we can go and have a look and we can see that we have that Jekyll syntax supported extension already present. So I could now invite somebody else from anywhere in the world to come and code with me and know that they've got exactly the same setup that I have when they come along. So I'm just going to push these changes in and commit them. And I'm going to re-sync that up. I'm just going to stop that. Now, there is one other cool thing that I wanted to show at this point. Yeah, because this has all been in a web browser, and I don't know about you, but I do a lot of alt tabbing around between what I've got going on, and sometimes I don't want to alt tab between hundreds of browser tabs. I want to alt tab to a VS Code instance, and because Visual Studio Code is basically the same thing that we're running here as well, what we can do is we can open a remote window, open up, connect to a code space. And we can see the URL across the top up here is the demo blog site W2WC. And I can see that I've got that there as well. And this is because I'm logged into GitHub inside my Visual Studio Code and I've got the extension installed. So I can now open that up and we are now running the same thing but inside proper Visual Studio Code. But this time it's Visual Studio Code is just the front end component of it. The dev container piece is still running inside GitHub's GitHub Cloud. The advantage to that is that you've got simplification that I'm running. As I said, you can alt tab to get Visual Studio rather than a browser, and it also means that I could run this front end on a lower powered machine. I don't need my awesome Surface Book 2 with 16 gig of RAM and an 8-core processor to run this. I could run this on my 10-year-old Sony Vaio with 2 cores and 2 gig of RAM, and it would probably work okay. Yeah. And just to show you that this is still running exactly the same thing, if I open up and I run exactly the same command, bundle exec Jekyll. Oh man, give me notes of a second. I can't spell all of a sudden. Yeah, okay. Does help if you're in the wrong directory, so I can see that this is now running, and I don't quite know why that crashed. Right, and I can open that up, and I have my code space running from here. Yeah. So, any more questions at this point? Because I'm pretty much at the end of what I've got to show you this evening.
Did you see there was one about mirror your local VS Code workspace?
Cool. Yes. So exporting, saving code space configurations. So the code space configuration is literally down to this dev container folder. Yeah. So what's in this .devcontainer.json and Docker file forms what you need. I wouldn't recommend saving, not committing your code and pushing it out, and then leaving the container to just sit there languishing. If I think about the intended kind of methodology of using this, using Codespace, you would spin a Codespace up, work on the actual project, commit the code, push the code back to GitHub, and then delete the Codespace again. Yeah, so you wouldn't end up with one sitting around for long periods of time. Yeah, if you do end up with one sitting around for long periods of time, I don't know how that would. You would end up with running up those storage costs for it. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question, David.
There was another one, David, about exporting.
So yes, the dev container config file, these files here form part of your code repository. So they go into the same life cycle of management as your source code for the application. Yeah, they're not separate at all. There's no other config files that you'd have. I saw another question from Richard. Yes, you can. The code spaces, and again, this is because there's a little bit of confusion here. I apologise if I've made it a little bit worse, but under the hood, GitHub Codespaces, Visual Studio Codespaces, and dev containers are all the same thing. They're just different ways of running the same thing. So with this blog here, I've run it. I'm currently running inside a Codespace. But if I close that remote connection, it goes back to being a Visual Studio Code. And if I go back to my repo, oh, shoot, I closed it. If I go back to my repo and clone this into my local machine, I can actually run it as a code space inside WSL. So if I go to I open that up like that, that will open up the folder in Visual Studio Code. If I then want to make it a code space, I then have to open it up as a remote container. And that effectively, it does help if I've got Docker running. Actually, I don't at the moment. So if I had Docker running, that would close Visual Studio Code and open it up in Codespace. Yeah, but running the back-end dev container, if I go back to that screen again, it would be running the dev container piece inside WSL and using Visual Studio Code as the local part. Yeah, so hopefully that kind of bridges that gap of why sometimes you see local URLs and sometimes you see remote URLs, because it depends upon where this container and where the local OS parts are running. Yeah. Then there's also a question about whether there's public and private code spaces. I think that's pretty much the same thing as well. If I'm running it with Visual Studio Code, which you can do today using the extension for dev containers, so remote containers, sorry, then that basically runs both of these parts on your local machine, and instead of the dev container Docker file and dev container.json running up something inside GitHub's cloud, you end up spinning that up inside Docker on your local machine. Yeah, hopefully, Richard and Sid, that kind of answers your questions?
Yeah, I think for me, Sam, it does. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Excellent. Right. At which point, I haven't got anything else to show at this moment in time. I was thinking about at some point showing off live share, but I'm not going to. Just be aware that there is a really great extension for Visual Studio Code called Live Share, which lets you do some cool stuff. But maybe another time I'll come and join the group and show that off.